Thanks for that nice introduction, and thanks to everybody for coming out this evening. I have been writing about nature for a long time, and I have to admit, years ago, when I first began to explore Florida, I did so more as from a recreational standpoint. Whether I was paddling a kayak, whether I was diving, cave diving, whatever, I just kind of went out there to have the adventure of it. But I since have learned, and that's come with a lot of reading that I've done through the years, and a lot of understanding of more transcendent ideas that nature helps communicate to us. That there's a lot more out there than just the thrill. And I was fortunate enough to be an English major in school, so I took the time after a couple of years of my early explorations and began to see all the different behaviors and all the different technology I was using was just simply that. They were tools. They were tools to help me understand a higher sort of idea about places. And other folks have of course done this through time in many different ways. And I have my own style, my own way of doing things. The Piece of Blue is a collection of what might be called narrative essays. They're simply true stories of me, just told in the first person usually, out in the landscape somewhere, mostly in Florida. A few take place in the Caribbean and the Antilles. But they all have to do with water, near water, atop water, underwater, and they try to, without becoming too intellectual or rhetorical, that they do try to analyze what it is a bit about water that makes our lives special. And I do try to weave this in the context of the story so that it doesn't bang you upside the head with its intellectual pretense. And of course, if you all have spent time in water, around water, and if you have your own personal relationships with it, then you'll know where I'm coming from on this. So, A Piece of Blue, Water Journeys, and I selected for the actual photograph for the opening slide was a photo I took down in the Amazon a few years ago, and I like the time warp factor in that it shows three men from a handmade wooden dugout getting ready to cast a net out to catch some fish. And the reason I do enjoy the time warp factor is this could easily have taken place in Florida 10,000 years ago when the Timucua and the Tequista and the people who made their own dugouts out of logs were out paddling, were out fishing, were out gathering the things they needed to survive. And to see that still happens in the world, it's just it's a wonderful way to time travel, if you will. And so I love these sort of parallels between time and place, and I've tried to understand them myself whenever they do take place. I will have to admit that despite the technology that I've learned and that I use sometimes, I'm not a techie guy, so I hold two pieces of technology in my hand, including one with a laser pointer. It's a little scary. So if you see a little green dot coming your way, just duck your head. It's not personal. So The Piece of Blue, the actual cover for my book comes from a wonderful piece of art that the Jacksonville artist Jim Draper actually did about a year ago. And just as I was finishing my book, I was working on a project with Jim up in Jacksonville, and I saw his finished artwork, and it's of a small spring that's part of the Juniper Run Spring System near Ocala National Forest. I said, Jim, you mind if we use this for the cover for the book? And he goes, yeah, man, sure, it'd be great. So thereby cutting through about 6 months worth of bureaucratic back and forth, and as a result, I'm really happy to have that for the cover itself. And while I'm not here chest beating, I will try to give you a bit of a taste of what I'm trying to do here from the introduction, which is for anybody trying to get a feel for water The larger bioregion of Florida and the Caribbean is surely a great place to begin. The oceans, springs, rivers, and lagoons are generally blue when they're not busy being turquoise or tannin, cobalt or gray. But a deeper, more personal look reveals another side, one that goes beyond color and form, sometimes skirting the edges of the great ecological unconscious itself. And once that blue is breached, there's no telling how far the perspective may roam. Early review, again, this is just a way of helping to explain the book itself. And I will, just in the beginning, through adventure and contemplative excursions, Belleville shares his contagious respect and awe for the singularity and transcendence of the natural world. And I like to think contemplative excursions is probably a description that really does fit this particular collection. Okay, now, what do we know, man? How long have we been here after all? Here are a few of my books, and there's a cover of a film that we did for Marjorie's Wake with a nonprofit film group we set up to do nature sense of place pieces. And here I am in my kayak. Here I am hiking at the edge of a ephemeral pond. Here's the book I wrote about the Harbor Branch exploration of Cuba when I was on that expedition a few years ago. That's a cover of the book, and some covers of a few other things here, just to give you an idea of how my own connection to water. And it's a picture of me when I'm a little boy, and me as a more or less grown man. And I go, while I've done my share of expository reporting, my inclination is to chronicle the feelings and observations that imprint themselves onto life. As a little boy, the larger world first opened itself to me as I sat on my grandmother's lap and she read stories to me from books, and she told me stories as well. Her stories inspired and motivated me. I wanted to explore the world, and here I am. I'm trying to, I'm out getting ready to go out of my crib and do that exploration. By the time I was an adult, I realized my childhood fondness for allowing a story-driven narrative to explain and enliven life had traveled along with me. Stories are very powerful. I mean, we were telling each other stories around the campfire long ago, long before we ever started writing them down or printing them in books. And I think a story has a dynamic that's almost on a genetic level, where we seek information that can be transferred, can be communicated to us in the form of a story itself. So I much appreciate the capacity of a story to be able to help us feel and understand and lead us to places in life where we may gain new insight about a particular place as a result. Anthropologist Lauren Isley, who is actually quite a good writer, once wrote, "If there is magic on this planet, it is contained in water." And here we have a Fern Hammock Springs, which actually was a spring that inspired Jim Draper to do his image of the spring for the cover, and that's in the Ocala National Forest. That's a picture I took right from the shore, and you can see the turquoise color of a very healthy spring. This is what a healthy spring looks like. And here we see a sea turtle navigating without considering political boundaries. 28 stories in the book range throughout Florida and Antilles, covering territory from what some have described as eco-adventure to an evening stroll along the river. And on the left is swimming with the dragons in the karst. And I'll show you a larger version of that map a little bit later, because it's a wonderful side profile of Silver Glen Springs, as rendered by probably the world's best cave cartographer who lives here in Ocala, and has been a great source of knowledge to me on the projects that we have worked on together. And on the right, this is me and a little Sheltie walking along the shore of the St. Johns River at dusk, and reflecting on the energy of a river, the energy of water itself. So here we have, these may seem like wildly disparate stories, but I like to think there is a deeper connection there, and hopefully it'll be revealed as the story is read. From the introduction, although it may sometimes seem adventurous, exploring blue is not a thrill-seeking quest. Instead, it's a way to allow the human sensibilities the latitude to acknowledge the true wholeness of our world. It's a wholeness that begins with reassembling the many pieces of ecology that surround us. Often pieces that have been broken apart, they become disparate because of our own attempt at civilizing our landscape. If we're lucky, it transcends science to embrace the emotional, intellectual, and spiritual energies that fuel the sublime fiber of our lives. And I used a picture a friend of mine shot off of a spring-fed river, and this was a slough, a little side slough, and I was sitting there having a quiet moment, contemplating the river, the woods, the swamp, the world. We do have over 50,000 very non-linear miles of river in Florida, over 1,000 springs, hundreds of lakes, and extensive coastline. So we've historically relied on a water-driven landscape to provide basic needs and to fuel our economy. And here at the very, our very earliest renderings of how that was done does relate to that very first image I showed you of the natives in the Amazon still fishing. And here we have Jacques Lemoyne, cartographer with a French expedition to Florida back in the 1500s. And he captured very well the essence of the people who were here along that part of the peninsula, then the Timucua, and paddling their hand-carved dugout into the water itself. Here we have Rice Creek from 1883. It has a steamboat, and when we see steamboats, they're usually large affairs with room for lots of passengers. But the fact is that there are a lot of steamboats that were smaller. They're just used by a family or maybe a couple families that would outfit them to do what they needed to do. This was back in a time too when we had a pre-dredged landscape out there, and our rivers were really the best way to get around. They were our aquatic highways. They were much more reliable than any sort of pathway that went through what could one day be dry and what the next day could be a swamp. And here's the Upper St. Johns River. I was researching a book on the St. Johns a few years ago and flew over with some of the scientists who study the river. And the upper part of the river looks much more like the glades, and certainly from the air we can see that this marsh, this wet marsh, glades-like surroundings, environs, does tend to keep development away from the edges of the river itself. So we do have a diverse water-themed menage, animals, plants, and landscapes. And as a result, it does set us decidedly apart from the rest of the continent. And here we have animals that we see elsewhere. Certainly the eastern black bear is not special to Florida, but the Florida black bear, which has speciated from the eastern black bear from being here so long, is a separate subspecies. We have separate subspecies in plants and in animals. We have certain birds like the scrub jay, which is special to scrub, not found anywhere else outside of Florida itself. Here we have our springs, as I mentioned before. We have more springs than any other, not just any other state, but any other region in the entire world. Here's the one of two vents or entrances to Silver Glen Springs on the right. That's so circular that the divers call that the well. And we have some fish in the bottom. Striped bass will come in schools, as will mullet, and circle in the bottom. Here we are out by paddling with a friend with a dwarf cypress, and we have cypress in Florida and in parts of the southeast, but having dwarf cypress, a tree that can be a couple thousand years old, but only maybe 7-8 feet tall. That's quite extraordinary. And to the very top, we have a sundew, a little carnivorous plant that lives in a bog. And in places like Florida, we still will have bogs, but these bogs are nitrogen poor because the plant, the sundew, as well as the hooded pitcher plant, can capture its own nitrogen on the hoof, if you will, by using its sticky philia to attract the insects that come nearby. Once they are entrapped, then they become digested, and they become they they fulfill the nitrogen need of the plant itself. So ecologically, Florida is part of the Caribbean Basin, and sometimes we see the Caribbean Basin as part of Florida's ecology, but it depends on what perspective you have on that. Neighboring currents and winds sweep across the larger bioregion of the Antilles and the peninsula of La Florida. Indeed, a lot of plants and animals that we do have here, I mean, including our state butterfly, the zebra longwing, were blown here from the Caribbean, and they became they colonized and they became naturalized as a result. So there's lots going back and forth, and certainly we are downstream from a lot of the current that do sweep up from the Bahamas and from Cuba around our peninsula, and that should be a very important consideration whenever we're dialoguing with anybody about any sort of future development, any sort of future negotiations that involve the involvement of the United States and an investment from the U.S. Blue that's more than a few inches deep will always be wild for us air-breathing mammals. And I find this to be fascinating because we can go underwater, we can go inside of caves, we can use snorkels, we can use dive gears. Still, this is only a temporary visit. You know, we're air-breathing mammals, and anything that's even a few inches deep is still wild to us. I particularly like this picture. We see the typical cave that I'm in here, that we see the spring and the clarity of the water. But here we see at Silver Springs, my friend Michelle is paddling, and I was just lucky enough the sun was shining in the right direction so we could see the underpinning of that soft limestone known as karst, which Florida has an abundance of, and which helps create the environs for the springs themselves, which are recharged by the rainfall in the upland areas. And it trickles through the porous sand, finds its way down to the soft limestone, and then by the hydrostatic pressure of the water above is pushed out into the springs itself. And here we see some of that soft limestone, that soft karst, right there at Silver Springs. As a life force, blue is not always domesticated, cultivated, or tame. Here I am in front of a spring newly discovered just a couple years ago, which is part of the fascination I have with springs in Florida, is that we're just learning about springs all the time, and we ought to be a little careful about how we manage them, how we manage water that comes out of our aquifer, how we manage the recharge areas that keep our springs alive. And if we're still discovering springs, if we're still discovering information about springs, then we might want to slow down on the actions that are going to, in some way, affect the quality or the health of that spring. And here we have a great blue heron finding that blue is certainly not always tame in a special moment when it gets a water snake wrapped around its beak. Florida River by night, and here we have we have several essays that are myself, maybe a couple friends simply paddling, and my reflections on it. We drive down a dirt road atop a massive pre-Columbian Indian midden, bleached and knobby snail shells packed tightly just under the patina of grasses and fresh white gravel. The river is flowing ever so gently, just as it has for thousands of years, and the midden slopes down as if to greet it. I like that particular photo because it pretty much, just as with the people in the dugouts, it pretty much captures a moment in time that could have been yesterday, last week, 2 months ago when I took it, or it could be 5,000 years ago. Well, most of the stories I wrote that are in this book, I wrote for the book, or I wrote for myself over a couple years. A few pieces came out of other places where I had written stories that I thought would fit, and this came out of a magazine piece that I did after traveling to the Dominican Republic, and I joined a team of underwater archaeologists who were diving into a very deep cenote there. And this is a peninsula on the east, eastern coast, southeastern coast of the Dominican, that was just loaded with that type of limestone, that karst that forms caves and forms the cenotes that they have there. And the Taino, we call them the Arawaks, but he spoke Arawak, but they were the Taino people who lived there. They had certainly a very close relationship with their nature, as did many Native Americans, and their gods represented different forces of nature, whether it was the sun, whether it was storms, whether it was a cenote. And this was one of the most sacred of all, where their zemes, their gods, had lived. And the point of diving there was that over time they had offered to their gods in this particular cenote many different things they had created, especially for them. Carvings from wood, beautiful bowls that they had decorated, even macrame baskets. It was full of food. And once the cave itself the actual water had to drop for some reason 7 or 8 stories beyond the opening in the floor of the jungle, which was about 7 to 8 feet in diameter. And so we had to rappel down to a Zodiac and get geared up to go to make the descent below that. Very deep cenote, but there was a cone of sediment that came up to within 110 feet of that surface. And within that cone were all of the artifacts that had been offered to the zemes over the years. And as a result, by the time this expedition was over, there were more, this created the largest repository of Taino artifacts in the entire Caribbean. And they were in great shape because they were inside the cone. They're inside this muddy cone where you have no light. You're losing your light at about 20 feet. You have no light, you were inside of mud, and it's anaerobic, so you have no oxygen. And if you're a piece of wood, if you want to survive, that's a good place to be. Hundreds of years ago, the native people known as the Taino came here in great numbers to the sacred cenote of La Anita in a dry tropical forest on the peninsula off Hispaniola. I'm dropping directly below the surface of the earth today, snug in my cable-rigged harness. The sunlight bounces off the clear cenote water into the limestone walls, dancing a merengue of pre-Columbian celebration. At the surface of the water, I trade my harness for some dive gear and begin my slow descent into the consuming darkness below. As I do, I silently ask the zemes for permission to enter their sacred world. And I did so in a very real way. That expedition had been there for, about 2 months before I arrived, and 2 seasoned marine archaeologists had already panicked and hyperventilated because of something that scared them inside the cenote. And I'm thinking, wow, this is something special going on here. And as I found myself breathing more heavily during my descent, I just stopped and said, I'm not here to do you any harm, guys. And after that, I felt okay. If I talked myself into it, fine. If the zemes said it's okay, fine. However it worked, I was good with it. I was fortunate enough to go on the Discovery Channel expedition to Cuba, which Harbor Branch engineered, and we were aboard the Oceanographic ship, the Stuart Johnson. And here's the Johnson Sea Link when it still existed, preparing to descend off the southern coast of Cuba. And that's what we explored most of the 6 weeks we were there. We sailed down from here and went down to the eastern horn of Cuba and around that horn, and then went all along the southern coast, which is the most remote and undeveloped coast of any island I have seen in the Caribbean. The wetlands were intact. They were in great shape. The clarity of the water was super. There's about 1,000 miles of coral reef along that coast. Several large gulfs, each of which has their own little crescent of islands, Guayacanabo and Montalbano and Anna Maria. And so we would get off the larger ship and take smaller boats and Zodiacs ashore. Sometimes we would talk to local natives, many of whom were fishermen who lived in villages along that coast itself. So, of course, the There were many discoveries made because this was the first high-tech expedition ever to go to Cuba, and Harbor Branch did an excellent job in recovering specimens via the Johnson Sea Link and via scuba dives, and then the actual experience was turned into a Discovery Channel documentary called Cuba Forbidden Depths. And here we are, a couple other shots I've taken from Cuba. And this is when we came around the Eastern Horn and we went into Santiago, which was our first port to stop. And here's a pilot boat coming out to greet us with an old fortress up there on the pinnacle there of the cove itself. The actual Santiago, the bay there is much like the St. John's. It was considered by early European explorers to be a great port. But then they discovered it also was a river that went on for a couple of 100 miles beyond its port itself. And the same is true for Santiago. Here we are at the end of the expedition where we had moored, come around the western cape and moored at the Malecon, and Fidel Castro came aboard to see where we had been. Very astute guy in terms of marine ecology, and he had a good Jesuit education as an attorney, but more importantly, he had scuba dived a lot of the places where we had been, and he was already familiar with some of the things that we were sharing with him, and he had some very informed questions to ask. And Cuba, here we see the old American Plymouth, a lot of the cars from the 1950s when the embargo was kicked in, and certainly I think that's a nice metaphor for the fact that if there's relics there on the street, there's relics in the water, there's relics in the natural system as well, and they are in great shape. And while most of the pieces in my book have to do directly with water, that doesn't mean that for the piece to be included, it has to have water on it today. Our scrub and sandhill are high areas in the topography of Florida were among the very first parts of the peninsula to emerge from the water as the oceans receded. And so singular scrub and sandhill ridges, distinguished by their endemic plants and animals, were created by a prehistoric sea that once covered Florida. Florida has its share of jungle safari rides and water-themed parks, but it's unlikely to ever promote its most cryptic and endangered ecosystem as scrub world. Of all our habitats here in Florida, it is the scrub, though, that most resist taming. It's very difficult to transplant any plants from a scrub to your home. You can go out into a woods, most places, bring things back, and they do okay. They don't do okay because they need that particular sand composite that scrub and sandhill provide. Walt Whitman, the true democratic poet of nature and spirit, once wrote, "I too am not a bit tamed. I too am untranslatable. I sound my barbaric yelp across the roofs of the world." And so I do think of scrub and sandhill as sort of the Walt Whitman of our habitat. They're untamed, they're untranslatable, they exist on their own for their own reason. And if we can appreciate them, that's to our credit. The real voyage of discovery, as Proust once told us, consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. This was a photo I took from Springfed River, a little slough that goes off to the side. You know, despite all we have done to our natural systems in Florida, we are very fortunate because voters some years ago did approve a referendum that allowed us to spend money to buy land in Florida. As a result, almost 1/3 of land and water in Florida is protected, either as a national, state, or parks, or state forest, or preserve. That stacks up really nicely to the average for most states where it's only 16 to 17%. Having new eyes allows us to access doorways to nature, culture, and sense of place. And doing so, it does inspire art in all its many forms. It has from the get-go, and it still does today. You see George Herbert McCord's Florida Sunrise, Werner Herzog, Sunset with Heron, and the painting on top could be from that era. because that mist and the way the light comes through it still has very much of that feel. But that was done not too terribly long ago by the artist Winter Park, who lives in Winter Park, Tom Schroeder, and he did that on the Wekiva River system. The discovery of having new eyes. Here's Springs artist Margaret Tolbert, and here she is snorkeling in Springs because that's what she does before she paints them. And she may snorkel once or twice or 3 times, or she may snorkel 20 or 25 times, depending on what she feels she needs to get from the spring. And one of the things she needs to get is she needs to see it in different ways, with light coming down at different times of the day. And then she's able to express what she sees and what she feels in her art. And Margaret says, when I first began painting the springs, I saw them as a prism of space and light, a clear and transparent space inviting entry. Later, I began to see the springs as a visible and palatable force. Margaret's sharp as a tack, she put together actually a self-published book several years ago, about 5-6 years ago, called Aquifarius. Kind of made that word up from aquifer, Aquifarius, and it was a large art book of her paintings and of some photography and of her explanations such as this as to why she's attracted to springs. That won the top honor for the Florida Book Awards for nonfiction the year that came out. So new ways of seeing. One person's swamp becomes another's work of art. Here's we have the actual photograph, family canoeing on the Wekiva River around 1900, and here we have the mirror reflection again of the shoreline, and it looks very much. If you could flip it around, it would look very similar. I find this to be fascinating, and I was surprised there was so little written on it. I kind of stumbled upon this and consulted with a couple archaeologists and then an anthropologist, and they go, yeah, that's really true, and we're having trouble really establishing that ourselves, but now we believe that this is true, and it sure does make a lot of sense. As our springs begin to flow in Florida, they nurtured a bounty of food and water for the nomadic Native Americans who were roaming Florida. There were people here 12,000, 14,000 years ago, the Paleo Indians. They had migrated down across the continent, migrated into Florida. Florida, at the time, during the Ice Age, most of the water was locked in the glaciers. Florida, as a peninsula, was almost twice as wide as it is today. Very arid. It had some water on it, a little bit of water here and there. It had plants, it had animals, but nothing like the diversity and the abundance that we have today. So the people who were here, the Paleo Indians, and then as they evolved into the Archaics, they had to roam. They were constantly on the move to hunt, to find food and to find water. Springs begin to flow. 9,000 years ago and 7,500 years ago, they really began to crank. And as a result, these people who were nomadic had the luxury of settling next to an actual spring head or maybe the spring run. And there they had potable water. They had access to the animals that began to migrate down from the continent into Florida and who also came to the springs. That gave them more time to contemplate their own place in the larger world. And as they began to do that, as they settled into sometimes what were villages, they began to imprint their culture on what they actually created. And whether it was tools, whether it was pottery, and this is wooden, these are wooden tools, and tools made from antlers and bone and so on, and pottery made, of course, from clay. And there's a wooden replica of a wonderful sculpture of an owl found down in the mud at Hantoon Island. So we have art imprinting itself onto people. We have art imprinting people, imprinting art onto everything around them. E.O. Wilson, the great Pulitzer-winning scientist, really nailed it, and he said, the greater the biological diversity, the greater the cultural diversity. And I can think of no greater way of illustrating that than to explain and to show the transition of how the people lived in early Florida and how they communicated their own culture vis-a-vis their carving and artistic merit. We learn that fully exploring the wholeness of place considers the broader ecology of myth, music, art, literature, and more. Here would be my spiritual mentor, William Bartram, who was here by himself in the 1760s. I'm sorry, here with his father, John Bartram, in the 1760s, and then here by himself. Again, they came here from Philadelphia. They were Florida back in that time was still very unknown. It was a very wild place. Bartram, he was a gentle Quaker. He was a self-taught artist. He drew many things that he saw in the landscape, animals such as that soft-shell turtle. He drew the pictures of the Native Americans who were here, and he really gave us, he was a guy who was sensitive, but he was also very adventurous, and he was quite the athlete. He would pull his way up to the top of cypress trees to see where he was on a river at any given time, to see where that river would flow. He was said to be an excellent swimmer, but he was also a very sensitive artist and very spiritual in nature. And so nature, both in his nature and spiritual in the nature that he observed around us. So we have music, art, literature, and we could go on and on and on here, but this, I just wanted to use this as an illustration. People like Stephen Crane writing the classic short story called The Open Boat, based on a real incident where Stephen Crane was aboard the Commodore when it sank off the coast of Daytona Beach. And he spent a day and a night with several other people on a small dinghy. And that became the basis for his short story, The Open Boat. Indeed, scientists and explorers traveled to Florida in the early 20th century just as others journeyed to South America and Africa today. It was a virtual Eden rich with undiscovered plants and animals. Here's Jacques Cousteau, not long after he helped to invent the aqualung as a young man. And here's botanist John Kunkel Small, who would come down regularly from the New York Botanical Gardens. Here he is with what he called his weed wagon, where he would collect plants, and the great majority of plants that he did collect had not been identified before, so he discovered or described new plants in this strange new land, not that terribly long ago. And this is what this fascinates me to no end. Despite the widespread perception of Florida as domestic and tame, discovery still happens. And one of the things I do like to do is take good topographical maps, go out and find places where it looks like a spring might exist somewhere out in the landscape, usually at the bottom of a high slope. And here I am walking across a log in a swamp, and as a result of that little excursion, myself and my hiking buddy found a new spring that was added to the inventory of springs in the St. Johns River system. And under the surface, I stuck my little camera under the surface. It goes underwater to 40 feet. Here was under the surface of the newly identified Sirena Springs. And the whiteness you see here is not an algae, that's a sulfur bacteria. You'll find that back in the caves, in the dark of the caves in the aquifer, and it's a bacteria that lives off the minerals. There's other types of bacteria that lives off minerals. This one lives off of sulfur itself. So acknowledging a sense of place begins with identifying where you live and by understanding the particulars of it. So you get right down to hardcore geography. I mean, you can identify that we have 5 water management districts in Florida. They're usually acknowledged by the fact that there's something shared in the surface rivers of their particular region. But there's other things that we can identify too about geography that will help us understand where we are. And certainly going out to experience it is a big part of that understanding. The nature writer, Wendell Berry, excellent nature writer, really nailed it when he says, if you don't know where you are, it's likely you don't know who you are. And I think sometimes our politicians rely on that, the fact that we don't really know where we are all the time, so they can twist reality in a special Orwellian way and tell us what they're doing is okay, when indeed it's questionable in many, many cases. Places, as writer Barry Lopez once wrote, do take on the energy of the people who've cared through them through time. And here's the headwater on the right top corner, the headwaters of the Wekiva River, what was then called Clay Springs and now called Wekiwa. Here's a small little spring on the back branch called Nova. My friend Michelle with the osprey feather near a spring on the other side of that log off of Blackwater Creek. And here we have celery growing in Sanford, and this is what people did at one time. They grew things, they harvested things, they found ways that had to do with sustaining themselves. And here's a steamship bringing in tourists to the local little waterfront hotels. Here's Michelle in her kayak. She actually is just now finishing up a film that she's working on her nonprofit, Equinox Documentaries, with Alligator Princess of America's Nile, in which she's paddled the entire St. Johns River, all 310 miles by herself. So to fully appreciate the value of a place, identify the most predominant natural feature where you live, then imagine what it would be like if that place were to vanish. How would you feel then? This is, I particularly like this place because it's on the St. Johns River. It's where the river dilates out into one of the many so-called lakes, and this is called Puzzle Lake, very much like the Glades again. But it's also nice to know that sometimes places are named for very appropriate reasons, and Puzzle Lake is indeed one of those. We learn the history of a place and the specific habitats it supports, but we also learn to acknowledge it on a deeper level. Here I am on the right side. I'm in Fort Drum Creek, which is just to the northeast of Lake Okeechobee at the headwaters of the St. Johns River, trying to find a place that's deep enough to put in a kayak. And I walked 2 days, camped one night, and I finally found a place. As readers, we discover where the fiction of Florida literature matches real life. How many have read Marjorie Kinnan Rollins's The Yearling? Great. She is a superb writer, and I'm very impressed with what she was able to do herself. She came down here, she's a Phi Beta Kappa from the University of Wisconsin, comes here with her husband Charles, and they settle in Cross Creek. And he decides he doesn't like it, and he leaves her and leaves Florida. And she could have bolted, but she stuck around. She learned about the people who live there, the crackers, and here's a really neat image of her from the head trail sign at the Yearling Trail in the Ocala National Forest, talking to one of the crackers, an old photograph of that at the time. So she talked to the people who lived here, she learned about their culture, and then she took the trouble to learn about the geography, to learn about the place. And so when she created a story in which little Jody Baxter would as part of his growing up, he would shun his adult duties and run away and play with his little flutter mill in a little spring where the twigs would spin around in the flow. Well, she based that on a little spring out near the Silver Glen system. It's called Boyle's Spring. You can still see that spring today, and here it is to the right with several little gambusia swimming around in it. Cross Creek, which was her most autobiographical of her books, the chapter Hyacinth Drift inspired a documentary that Equinox, our nonprofit documentary company, did, and we retraced the journey Marjorie Kinnan Rollins and her friend Desi Smith Prescott once made on the St. Johns. That came at the time when Marjorie's husband left her, and she had been there long enough to make friends, and her friend Desi came over, brought some moonshine with her, sat around and said, you know what you need to do, darling? You and I need to get in a boat, and we need to explore the St. Johns River. And I always wanted to see where it came from. So they spent 10 days on the St. Johns River. They found a local boy to drive them in his truck all the way down to Puzzle Lake. And then they spent 10 days going back downstream and up the Ocklawaha as close to Cross Creek as they could get. And here was the cover of In Marjorie's Wake, of the film we did, and a piece of artwork which Jake Glisson, who was an 8-year-old boy, was the closest neighbor to Rollins at the time. And Jake did that artwork. Here's Marjorie to the right, sitting outside at her home, typing on an old manual typewriter. And here's a really great picture of Desi Smith Prescott. And it was great because we were getting ready to film In Marjorie's Wake a few years ago, and we discovered that Desi at 96 was still alive and very lucid. So she was living in Yankeetown with a couple people. We went over to visit her and asked her if she would mind going out next to the water and doing a filming. We could talk to her a little bit on camera. So we did, and when she sat down on the dock out there, and of course there was wood behind her head of the dock itself, and we needed to raise her above that, and we didn't have anything there to do that. And he says, well, there's a bar stool in my house. So we sent one of the guys in to get the bar stool, brought it out, and as spry and as active as her mind was, her body was still, she was 96, and she couldn't get on the bar stool. So I lifted her up, put both arms around her, put her arms around my neck, picked her up, put her on the bar stool, set her down, and then in the background we saw cypress and water and all the things that fit with what Desi was about. But when I sat her down on the bar stool, she shook her head. She goes, it's been a long time since I had a man around me like that. And within the context of Cross Creek and the context of the chapter on Hyacinth Drift, and what that had to do with, of course, was they got lost in Puzzle Lake, like anybody could easily get lost today, even with a compass. Very easy to do because the channels splay out. There's quite a grid work of very shallow channels in that lake. Forever after, when the river sprawled in confusion, we might shut off the motor and study the floating hyacinths. That was Desi's idea, because she said, well, where the hyacinths are floating in a faster motion, that means there's deeper water there, and so we should go to that place. And they did, and it worked for them very well. From a book that I wrote right before this one, from Salvaging the Real Florida, we talk about a little bit about swamps. We talk about water again, although that book had more to do with other excursions throughout the different landscapes. Because they are given the nuances that leak into our consciousness, swamps confuse many into thinking these complex resources are less than they are. As people who care about nature and place, we listen to the particular dialect of the landscape as it tells its story. At the bottom left here is a wonderful old cracker farmhouse I bought and lived in for almost 15 years. And after living there about 10 years, an aggressive local city expanded its boundaries so it could encourage a mall to be built. And the mall was built less than 2 miles from the home. And that basically, the domino effect of that with commercial construction really destroyed the sense of the neighborhood and everything that went along with it. But before I left, as I saw that happening, I wanted to chronicle that experience because that house was built so well. Built in 1928, built out of heart cypress. And here's a picture on the right of the fellow who built it with a hand saw and hammer. And if you guys have ever worked with heart cypress, you know how difficult that will be. And there's his little daughter, and she was the woman that I talked to who was in her 80s at the time. That's little Zona Matthews. And that was just about 1928, 1929, when the house was almost completed. And I talked to Zona, and she was also sharp as a tack. And she helped me better understand how, not just that home, but how people lived at the time and how important homes were. They weren't homes built by a developer to make money. They were homes built by people who wanted their family to be protected, who cared about their family. And that whole concept seemed to splay off, seemed to diffuse out throughout the entire culture as well. Didn't end with the building of a home. Nonetheless, identifying a true sense of place in Florida has always been challenging. And here, even Jacques Lemoyne had his moments. And here we have the Timucua in this wonderful rendition, gaily poking a large log into the mouth of what would be in comparison to the 6-foot-tall Timucuan, it would be about a 40-foot-long alligator, easily twice as long as anyone that exists in real life. It would have large human hands and external ears. And I'm thinking, well, at that time, when Lemoyne drew that, how many people from France had ever seen Florida? How many people from anywhere had ever seen Florida? So I said, hey, what the heck? I can go ahead and create what I want. And folks did seem to take that idea to heart, because we see a lot of older pictures that do tend to embellish, if you will, on what the landscape was about. And sure, yeah, did we have a landscape that was rich, that was Baroque in many ways, and that was almost Gothic in other ways? Yeah, we had it. But also, if you have an artist with a great imagination, that landscape can take on a life beyond reality. Here's a book. This came from a book called The Knockabout Club in the Everglades, and this was one of the pen and ink drawings from that book, published in the 1800s. And within that drawing, we see a bromeliad that's about 7 feet tall, and we see pygmies with spears. Not in the glades I knew, but I mean, maybe he saw them. But the challenge and lack of connection continues today in ways that aren't quite as artistic. Until the recession, Florida was growing at a rate that would have resulted in build out within 50 years. And this is the sort of thing here with this type of construction, with this type of wall-to-wall development that simply, well, number one, there's very little character to it, but the more important thing in terms of the sustainability of the landscape is, where do you put these sort of developments? Because the surface that was once porous and that once accepted rainfall is now covered with impervious surfaces, streets, rooftops. So if this is in a recharge area of a spring, then you're losing that ability of that spring to be recharged. And indeed, that's one of our challenges today, is that most of our springs in Florida are declining in magnitude as a result of what we have done to our recharge areas. We haven't acknowledged the fact that these recharge areas exist, and so we've allowed almost anything to go on there as a result. And what happens? Well, we're at a place now where Silver Springs, once the largest spring in the entire world, has lost half of its magnitude since the 1950s. If that continues, within 15 years, it will no longer run. Silver Springs will be dry. So it does, what we have here is not only the loss of the environment, we have the loss of the economy that's based on the environment. So when we talk about sustainability, that's what we talk about, not just things that have to do with tree hugging, but things that have to do with, how do we keep our economy healthy? How do we keep our economy functioning on a long term, not just short term, but on a long term? And the answer most of the time comes from, how do we keep our environment sustainable, functioning on a long term? Florida's economy has always been anchored by its natural places, indeed, but the lack of a cohesive statewide ethic for nature has allowed short-term economics to trump sustainable growth. Here's Kissingen Spring outside of Bartow in 1947. Here's Kissingen Spring today. Hidden Springs of Florida is our PBS film that we're working on, and I got to see what was inside that particular cave, dry cave there on the left. It's at Rock Springs near Apopka. After John Moran, a photographer, nature photographer at Gainesville, started to work on a project, an exhibition of photography called Springs Eternal, and he asked me if there was there were any springs that had unique features to them in my area. I said, yeah, there's several, and was able to get permission to get inside that cave there, which at one point was actually completely full of water. Not terribly long ago, less than 200 years ago. And inside the cave, we see a little bit of water there at the bottom. We see John's crawling through typically the classically rounded shape, and here of the rock. And here we see in that bottom right-hand picture, the rock itself that has that karst, that soft limestone karst, that has been carved over thousands and thousands of years by the water that once flowed through it, but which no longer does so. Within the context of our documentary, we're talking with former Governor, U.S. Senator Bob Graham. We'll be talking, we have Margaret Tolbert, and here's another example of some of her fine work. Here's Eric Hutchison, the cave cartographer, and we're at the shores of Silver Springs right there, putting together a trailer which helps folks understand what the film itself, which is now underway, is about. And here's an archival picture of a steamboat coming into Silver Springs. And here's Eric with one of his wonderfully rendered drawings of the cave system inside of Silver Glen Springs, which is in the Ocala National Forest. And there's Eric, there's a picture of Eric sketching inside that cave, sketching, measuring, compiling the data he needs to go back in his studio to then create that kind of illustration. And so we have this one, on one hand, wonderful artwork, but also what we have is we see that clearly a spring goes beyond the hole in the ground. It goes quite a distance through the landscape itself. And being aware of that is also part of sustainable living and sustainable planning. Nonetheless, despite all of our losses, we still have a chance for discovery in a relic Florida wilderness that's once nearby and also far away in time. In doing so, we get to know the natives and soft-shelled turtle, the manatees, the Florida-spotted gar, and here I am diving with a Caribbean reef shark, and this is what happens when you dive with a really good photographer for National Geographic who wants to get the very best picture he can get, and that's the most important thing in the world. And we were on the bottom, I guess in about 50 feet of water. There were several sharks up near the surface, and they were just lazily swimming about. And he was able to communicate to me if I could get up about 20 feet off the bottom and swim this long, lazy circle so he could take pictures of me. Well, when I did go up and I swam a long, lazy circle, apparently one of the sharks came down right above me and followed me the entire way. And I didn't know this until after we got back and he showed me the picture. So I think there's two lessons there. One, if you dive with a photographer from National Geographic, you want to be very careful. Number two, sometimes it's better not to know. So we do get to know the natives too, botanically. And here I mentioned the carnivorous hooded pitcher plant, and here they are up there at the top. They live in the same bogs as the little sundew. Here's the river iris on the right, wild river iris, very common, and will start to bloom because we've had a mild winter in the early spring along the creeks of many of our rivers. Here we have a native orchid, butterfly orchid, and one of our native lilies as well. We identify wildlife with a special affinity for our place. I mentioned earlier the scrub jay, an obligate species. He does not live outside the scrub. He's learned to live in the scrub, to fly between low trees and shrubbery, and just simply does not exist elsewhere. It's our only bird species that is special to Florida. It does not migrate out of Florida. As we slow down, we learn to see and to appreciate the nuances tucked away in the folds of nature, and whether the nuances are human, or man-made, or natural. On the bottom right, we see the small apple snail eggs that you find along the edges of the creeks and the spring runs. We see the shards of pottery left behind in shell middens. We see the small fungus, very tiny, only the cap is the size of a dime, growing along fallen logs. We suspend linear time for a while when we go out into nature, and that's when nature plays a secret chord, and we let loose of our intellect and allow our senses a go at it. Nature becomes a place then to indulge myth, to evoke shards of timeless magic, to search for natural realities that are sublime instead of merely virtual and safe. And where does myth begin and where does it end? My daughter comes to visit, and what do? I take her to Gatorland, and we stand inside the giant mouth of an alligator. That's what you do in Florida. And here we have a real gator, and this was when I was paddling once on the Swanee River. I was on a little bluff taking the granola and water break, and I looked down. There was quite a large gator that was hanging in the water right below me, well disguised by the foliage that was also reflected on the water. So we have real gators, we have make-believe gators. Where does myth begin? Where does it end? An obligate species in its own habitat, and that would be me, taken with a friend when she and I were paddling out on the Mother's Arms portion of the St. Johns River, not a very well-known part of the river, but it's a quite beautiful part. And we were coming sundown, and the last mile out beyond those large cypress trees took us across open water, but I was so happy to be there at the time. If we are lucky, we may still find enough wildness here to take the shrillness of civilization out of us. where we can still learn the trick of the quiet. And if there's no other reason for going out into nature, that's a pretty good one all by itself. Thank you, guys.